Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this D-Zone Fireside Chat on security best practices in your CI/CD pipeline, sponsored by Red Hat. CI/CD pipelines play a critical role in accelerating software delivery and driving rapid innovation for every company. However, today's rapid pace of software delivery is coming with a heightened risk of security issues. And we're going to get into some very interesting stories here in a little bit, which require a new set of best practices to ensure integrity in those pipelines. My name's Jesse. I'm the chief technologist here at D-Zone, and I am thrilled to be moderating this discussion with some esteemed cybersecurity experts. We have the privilege of having Burr Sutter, chief developer evangelist at Red Hat. Hey, Burr.
Hey there, Jesse.
And
How you doing?
hey, yeah, I'm great, man. Thanks for being here. And Ishelle Ruiz, developer advocate at JFrog. Hey, Ishelle.
Hi, Jesse. Thank you very much.
Awesome. And Ishelle's from JFrog, and our guests are in this every single day with developers and security experts. We're going to use their experiences and insights to guide us through this world and share some actionable examples with you to help you increase your security posture and harden your own environment. Now, if you find today's discussion valuable and you want to see other events like it or share it with your colleagues, hop on over to dzone.com/events where you can see more of our on-demand content. So let's go ahead and dive right in. Burr, let's start with you. So can you give us a rundown of what we mean by software supply chain? I normally think of supply chain with like manufacturing or Walmart or something like that, and how that plays into CI/CD.
Well, I got to tell you, I love the Walmart example because that's very near and dear to my heart. I spent 4 years working at Walmart, paying my way through college. So,
Nice.
yes, I know something about supply chain from the real world perspective, including manufacturing. My brother-in-law still works in manufacturing, but it's related, and we use the same terminology. And you can think of it as a physical supply chain, meaning we are gathering all these different ingredients and these different components. In many cases, we're downloading them off the internet from a place like Maven Central or npmjs.org or PyPy, and we're gathering all these different components and ingredients and assembling them into our final product like a manufacturer would. And that would be, of course, a software deliverable like a software application.
Right.
And dealing with that supply chain, making sure we're actually consuming quality ingredients, we're not consuming bad things in that supply chain. And if
Mm.
in fact we do consume a bad thing, we could issue an instant recall if necessary, right? Because we might have to pull things back off the shelf. So I do like that concept of the physical supply chain as a metaphor because one, it appeals to me, and two, I think it does help people get their head around what we're trying to do when it comes to managing that software supply chain.
Awesome. Now, things have changed over the years, right? 20 some years ago, I was a developer and we didn't have things like Maven. We checked in third party things into our, whatever source control that we had at the time. And things have really dramatically changed, right? We don't build on a Linux machine in the back room for 2 days anymore, right? We have a very complicated process. So, Michelle, what are some of the threats that we now face now that we have a more complicated process that allows us to move faster? And I want you to talk for a minute specifically about how this idea of the attack surface has evolved, right? Particularly when we're talking about these components and these third-party services.
Okay, well, actually, trying to go back a little bit what Bert says about the supply chain.
Yeah.
One of the things that is important to notice here is that, for example, an ingredient in a traditional one can be only used once. For example, if you detect a problem with a specific batch, you know that it's like very, very well defined. In software, because we are reusing the same component potentially millions of times, well, if there is a problem, the impact is felt all over the world. Like, this is not
Mm,
going to be only your like local grocery store. If something happened, it's going to be all the grocery stores in all the world.
That's a good point.
That is how dramatic it is. And the other thing that we also need to consider is that it's not only about the ingredients, it's also everything that is involved into creating or taking this particular product into the shelves or even in
Mm,
your own house. So it's not only like we're talking about even before, like how is the factory working? Are we
mm,
clean enough in the factory? So
yeah.
there's a lot of inflection points where software it's being compound. So let's talk, and that's why the surface of attack is so much. It's either how we are dealing with our dependencies,
Right.
where are we building our software, for example, or even configuration of even authentication authorization roles. I mean, everything that involves building software, it has potential points of abusing, attacking, or sometimes that's even the problem. Sometimes we detect a problem because we have a not so great configuration. So see, even things that shouldn't be a problem
Yeah.
can become a problem. So now what we're trying to do is bring all these problems as fast as possible into the life of developers,
Mm.
because a security issue, it's already um, a cost, because they usually are detected when we are already suffering something. It's too late. Like the definition, when you find a security thing, the first thing that you have to say, like, we found it too late. If
Yeah.
it's outside in production, it's already costing us. So
All right.
the surface, sorry, very quickly, it's the surface. It is immense. And poor developers like me are, we are like, oh my goodness, what are we going to do? But we will discuss best practices step by step, facing the monsters one at
Awesome.
a time.
Awesome. So I want to dig into that for just a second. I started out as a developer and then ran some pretty big teams. The biggest team I ever had was like 150 people all over the world. And the one thing that I realized is that the more developers I have working on something, the greater chance that one of them is going to screw something up. All right, on any given day. I see Burn on his head because we'll talk about this for a second. I remember when Maven came out, Maven Central, and developers are always downloading stuff off the internet, right? They're getting code, they're getting third-party libraries, and all that kind of stuff. How do I know where the boogeyman is? Like, how do I know and monitor this? Burr, what are some of the things that we can do?
Well, it is kind of funny what you're describing there when it as it relates to people downloading things, because that is in fact what developers do. And as a matter of fact, I did a demo already this morning describing that to a group of people that I had within Red Hat, where I actually went to Maven Central and showed them how you can copy and paste from there with a little bit of XML into your POM XML right within your IDE. It's just that easy. That's what we've been doing. Google, Stack Overflow, copy and paste, right? That's the primary tools you need to know as a software developer. And you might think that's funny sounding, but I just had a conversation this
Oh,
past weekend with a very close, let's call them relative, right? That basically is learning programming for the first time and experiencing this magic from the very first time. So they're experiencing what it means to be a developer. Like they can type arcane commands on a keyboard and magic happens. They can create stuff from nothing. It's a digital creation, but that copy and paste from Google Stack Overflow into their IDE, Visual Studio Code in this case, was
mhm.
like magic to them. And I then said, well, let's talk about security now.
Yeah.
And they're like, okay. By the way, this was a military related thing, which was even more interesting. But like,
Mm,
what do you mean? Is there security implication if I pull stuff from the internet? Yes, there is. Yes, there is. And let's talk about those things. But that was just my weekend, right? So this happens to me all the time, these kind of conversations. And I think it is something that developers have to be much better educated on because it is problematic. It has historically been mostly safe. You know, we've kind of got away with it for
yeah.
years. But Struts 2 taught us some valuable lessons, and certainly
Mm.
things like Shell Shock and Heartbleed taught us some valuable lessons. And Log4j, back in December 2021,
Oh,
kind of
yeah.
really rippled through our universe and really taught us a very valuable lesson. And I think at this point, you know, ignoring solar winds, which is a completely different attack vector, like
Mm,
Ishel was talking about, you know, there are now all these potentially complicated ways we've constructed our entire assembly line, our CI/CD systems, and therefore the software that goes through it and comes out the other end. And we have a lot of work to do now to basically shore all that up and ensure that we're not shipping bad things to customers, is a way to think of it.
yeah. Michelle, anything that you want us to throw in there and suggest? I mean, I know we all got battle stories, right? Somebody's going to talk about developers checking passwords in at some point, but you know, from your perspective, as we walk through these things, the strut example was a big one. You know, what are some of the things that you would suggest to try to track and find where the boogeyman is? Right. I love it. Bird's like, you got to tell developers. My oldest son's 20 and I tell him the same thing. But what, you know, how do we go about doing this?
Okay, one of the things that I like to say is that we don't need to reinvent the wheel. And once
Okay.
we learn a lesson, we can apply it again and again. And there are different discussions that we can have about what version should we be using. If
Mm,
it's mature enough, it has a good test. So we are curating in a simple way the rules that we as developers should follow, or at least best practices in order to choose on a particular dependency, either the type or the version, the gap coordinate, the group ID, the artifact, and the version. For example, and that's something that many tools, like for example, the ones that obviously I work for, we're trying to do that. Like we gather all this information, we test it, and instead of letting my fellow team of developers figure out by themselves and pay
mm,
that price, what you can have is either share the knowledge that you already have, like between the different the dependencies, or for example, having simple policies and saying, you are doing a POC, go nuts, try to solve it, show me, like go creative. But you
mm.
won't have the same policies if it's in production. In production, I want like the most mature version of this particular dependency. I want the one that it has been tested. I want so many things for sure. So for example, I already gave you some information, like define some policies, find a tool that actually are implementing those policies so your developers don't have or know how to act in the different
Yeah.
context. If it's production, if it's your sandbox, well, you will have different way of
Yeah.
reacting, but this has to be known. And do not reinvent the wheel,
I like
like
that.
share the knowledge. Like if you already have tested, write some metadata, extend the knowledge of your organization and distribute it.
I like it. I like the idea. We got to talk about it. We have to agree on a set of criteria and then write it down in a policy. I love that. Those are perfect things for those out there in our audience to take away. I do want to dig in a little bit though into this. I don't know what's lurking in my code, right? So I want to shift our conversation a little bit to the idea of an S bomb. What is an S bomb? Right? I know to me, like a bomb is a bill of materials, right? But this idea of an S bomb, Vex, while I'm writing my code, developers, it's kind of a foreign concept in a lot of developer circles. So what is that? Now I have to develop code and write it, and I have to worry about this S bomb thing. What the heck is that? How do I start that? What is provenance and attestation? And feels like a bunch of red tape is getting in my way. What do you think?
Well, there are a lot of thoughts about S-bombs, and here's what's funny. You said bill of materials, but I have to say, when I say S-bomb to people, they think something that blows up.
Like an atom bomb.
That's what they hear. They hear the
Oh,
bomb part of that. They're like, wow, yeah, that sounds like a critical vulnerability. It blows up. No, I don't mean that kind of bomb,
yeah,
right? The bill of materials is basically what you're describing. And that is, of course, related to supply chain and what we see in inventory management and manufacturing
yeah.
and all the things associated with distribution. The bill of materials is super critical. But you're right, developers would find it as an additional headache, additional artifact they would have to produce, an SBOM being a JSON document of a type of format that gives you everything you need, all the ingredients that went into the application. The part that's hard, at least what I find is hard for developers right now, is the various automated tools that produce SBOMs are
Mm,
inadequate, right? There's some
uh-huh.
out there in the various open source land, various IDE plugins, Maven plugins, things like that, but they might give you only a surface area SBOM, not all the transitive dependencies. It might not understand things like a Maven shaded jar or Maven plugin, or the fact that a Maven plugin is needed for development but not needed at runtime. And so there's lots of different issues associated with those kind of details. But then the SBOM is actually incomplete if you only look at the jar file or even only the
Mm,
source code. The entire stack that it sits on, including the RPMs that were installed to make up the base layer, are also super critical to think about the SBOM holistically. And so, yes, that is a challenge. It does sound like it's going to be the silver bullet, right? If we just had SBOMs, all problems would be solved. But but it's not so easy to get that perfect SBOM that truly adequately paints the picture of everything that we've included in that product that we're shipping. And this becomes more important now that we're having to ship product to the federal government, right? Where it becomes a requirement to provide the SBOM as part of the artifacts that go to the government. But I could talk a lot about this, but I'm certain Michelle has a lot of interesting comments and thoughts on this
I'm
one
sure
topic
she's
alone
ready to go.
also.
She's been holding back. I love it.
Yeah.
No, I just want to mention, like, if we looking under the bed, what we're going to see. First of all, as Burr said, if you are a provider for the government from the US government, oh my God, this is a topic that you are listening so much. The other thing is not only in the US, because for example, the Cyber Resilience Act in Japan, like NISA in the European Union, they are already adopting. They are either introducing their own plans or certifications, and it's moving. So this is a topic that you don't kid yourself that is only applying for the US or only applying for Europe. This is something that is going to be, again, global. So when I go into with developers and they ask me like, is this really a thing, Excel? Like, and I like to tell them, like, remember GDPR? Like,
Oh,
this is chapter 2. That is how it's going
got
to
it.
get us. And
They'll get that.
exactly. So it is going to happen right now at so many levels. We are ironing out the details because the first question, and this is just to give you an idea of how complicated and how many moving parts we have right now. The first question is like, Shell, we should generate this bombs. And I was like, yes, 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 let's generate them. And they were like, my second question is like, which of the standards? And they were like, what do you mean, Shell? Are there more than one standard? How does that actually plays with a standard? Like, no, there are several standards. So,
Mm.
for example, and we aren't even agreeing so much into which one. So the most typical one are the two that are going to be winning in the conversations is Cyclone DX and SPDX. So those are the ones that most of the tools that Burr was referring are able to create. And just to add just a little bit more complication, SBOMs are different types. We're talking about source SBOMs, build SBOMs, execution SBOMs. So not only you should ask me like, is this a thing? Yes, it is a thing. Which one? And I will ask you later. There are 3 standards, but you can choose. Not only that, like what type? And I can tell you, well, it's going to be mostly source and build SBOMs. So as you can see, there are some things that we haven't figured out at the industry level. The other hurdle that we're facing is where should we publish or consume our SBOMs? But what I want to tell people is like, we need to start thinking about creating the tools and using the tools because this is a very interesting, vital concept and tool, and it's changing. It's changing as we are moving. So it's important that we keep an eye and understand what are the requirements and what are the offerings and choose wisely.
Yeah. And listen, I know that there are probably developers that are going to be out there watching this getting hives. The whole idea of shift right over the last couple of years feels like we're shifting everything on the developers. And like, I'm not a security expert. We had a VP of engineering tell us, he said his developers are not security specialists. They weren't trained in it. They didn't take cybersecurity classes, in their programming courses. They're just trying to get through the sprint, push some code out and get something shipped so that we can sell it and make money and all that kind of stuff. And how do we help these teams do better with all of this stuff? I mean, SBOMs, it feels like a hard topic, or at least a complicated one to start with. How do we help them do better without stopping the production engine? Like, how do we keep the business moving? Right. Not only are the developers sitting there getting hives, but I'm sure there's a product manager out there going, oh, this is just going to add another 3 weeks to my schedule. Right. So how do we help them work through that?
I have so much things to say there. So there are several ways. You mentioned so many things in your question that it seems so innocent, Jesse. Like, first of all, is like, right, we are not security experts and we shouldn't. Like, suddenly when we started as developers, my task, it was knowing my programming languages, my tools, my build tools, and suddenly it was also about deployments. So adding containerization, and you started like, and then observability, and then so many things that are starting adding to my list of tasks as a developer. And now they are like, and now I also want you to take decisions about security. I'm like, what? Like,
Exactly.
honestly, it's not in my job description. And this is the entire point that we're trying to make clear for either the organization or the developers. You need to enforce it. You are going to be the one that is going to be like, woke up in a Friday night at 8 p.m. like there's a problem with your release. But in another way, we have to tell them like, you know what? We are going to prioritize all the security vulnerabilities or findings. We are going to give you a set of policies and tools that are going to help you contextually towards our deployment environment or testing environment or whatever we know that is our business that actually matches and helps you decide how you're going to invest your time and effort.
Yeah.
Because again, we know, Jesse, if everything is top priority, then
Nothing.
nothing is top priority. So we
Correct.
need to provide our developers with a way to actually identify, don't overwhelm them
Mm,
with either problems or don't overwhelm them with requirements that they need now to learn.
mm,
So, yes, they are going to be the ones working on it. And they are the first line of defense and the most important line of defense because everybody is like, oh my God, they are like the weakest link. I'm like, we're talking about developing software and they are the developers. I think what you're saying is that they are the key part
like
of
that. Yeah.
developing software.
Nice.
Not the weakest link, but the key part. But okay.
Love it. And for those of you out there, listen, we've got about 10 minutes left. So if you have questions for our experts, write them into the chat. We're going to have a Q&A session after we're done. So take just a minute, write in those questions. There's a lot of stuff we're covering. And yeah, you're right. If everything's a priority, nothing is, right? We've got alarms blaring. We got all this stuff. Burr, what do you think about all this?
Well, what I think is so funny is we recently went through a global pandemic, and all of us are kind of scarred by that. But think about one of the key things we had to explain to all humans on this planet. It all went through the media, social media, regular media. We had to teach people how to wash their hands. Think about that for a moment. We had to teach people how to wash their hands and why it was important. And I see that as the same issue we have now with software development and managing that software supply chain and helping developers better understand the security implications of what they've done. We need to teach them to wash their hands. How about
Nice.
that? Get those bad germy things off their hands before they put that keyboard to use and type things into the computer. But there's one key element that I think is super important about this whole area. And I have a slide in my presentations where I go out and talk about this specific issue.
Yeah.
It has to do with the fact that developers are feeling overwhelmed. And the slide I have, really describes this over the decades. If you started in software development back when I did, you only had to know a couple of things to be a really great software developer. You might have known COBOL or Pascal or BASIC. Those were the ones that were involved with, or C. There wasn't even C++ back then. And there was no graphical user interface, there was no mouse, there was no event-driven user interface and
That's
GUI.
awesome.
It was just simple, right? Batch applications to move data from one file to another file. Life was simple. And then, of course, we got into the world of the internet with all these HTML frameworks and JavaScript and everything else. And we have model view controller, object relational mapping, all these patterns. And next thing you know, we're now looking at, oh my God, Kubernetes and YAMLs and deployments and Helm charts. And it just keeps going on and on and on. So one key element I see from many teams is that idea that you need to reduce cognitive load on the developer because it is
Point.
overwhelming at this point. And therefore, can you move more things into the platform itself, into the machinery? And if we go back to that manufacturing concept again, my brother-in-law is an engineer for manufacturers. And that
Nice.
means his primary job is to create the assembly line in such a way so that the people who have to do the work have the easiest, smoothest possible path to do the work,
Yeah.
right? And they design the actual pipeline, if you will, otherwise known as a assembly line. And
Sure.
that seems to work out really well. And I'm finding that with a lot of our customers, they're doing the same things, creating these platform engineering teams, as a phrase you might heard throughout the industry at this point. So
Yeah.
we could spend a lot of time talking about those concepts also.
I love it. And it's funny. I was helping again my 20-year-old son with grep today. He's like, Dad, have you ever used Linux? I'm like, oh yeah, come on, let's get in the shell. But you're right, it builds on itself.
Mhm.
So you can't ever let anything go. So we have to figure out, what can we automate, what can we eliminate, and focus on. I love that. Well, we've got about 8 minutes left, so I want to switch over and talk about. I love the way this was put: the monsters under the bed. Right? Like, what are the real pain points? What are we fearing? What do we see from a customer perspective, and how do we guide them to something better? And I know we're not, shouting products, but I was a dev manager, and I used a really cool repository for my artifacts. And this is the point where Michelle smiles really big. Um, and I'm telling you, if you can automate and have your tools do some of that stuff for you, it's great. So I'll say that before the experts do. But if y'all will open up a little bit and tell us a little about these customer pain points, and how we can move to something better. Right? Michelle, you want to go first? Burr, you want to go first? Somebody lead us off. I don't care.
Michelle, get in there.
Yeah, do it.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. One of the things that we have discussed, for example, is the SBOM. And I know that we're not going in the right order, but I'm passionate about this one.
Yeah.
So as I said, you have to find the specific tools for creating this. And you have to understand and publish it and consume it. And as I said, there are different types. So what you need to pick and choose is something that is supporting whatever your requirements
Mm,
in the downstream is
mm,
requiring of you. And as I said, this is changing fast, but there is good news. I mean, I belong, not only JFrog is really interesting, but the entire open source community, it's interesting and working on it. So this is something that is going to be surprising for developers. There are working solutions already. They are improving every single day, I can tell you.
mm. Awesome. All right, Burr.
And I do love that phrase, "monsters under the bed." That's Shell's famous phrase, I think. That's at least that where I heard it from. And yeah, but because it's really something to get people to think about, and I think it helps you visualize there are creepy crawlies under the bed that we should be worried about, but at the same time, if we just look under the bed, if you remember being a child, there's actually nothing really that bad under there except dust bunnies and a maybe lost stuffed animal. So you really have to really think about how to face your fears in this category, and there are so many things that we could be doing. I'll give you one example. I talked to dozens of Red Hat customers, and Artifactory is that repository as an example that people do love for storing all their artifacts as an example. I find that time and time again. But I can tell you there's actually challenges around the use of that also because people are like, well, you would ask them, well, how do you actually get a new artifact that you did want to download off the internet, but someone stopped you from doing so? How do you get that approved and put into the workflow so that you do have it in your internal repository and available to the build engine for CI? And that process can be clunky depending on the nature of the organization. It can actually add several days, if not weeks, of friction to what the
Yeah.
developer is trying to do. The same thing is also true if you have a vulnerability that is in fact in one of your transitive dependencies or even in your main code base. But it's not a problem. The code doesn't call that path. There, you don't expose that port, right? Well, there's all these different ways to mitigate that particular vulnerability, and it's just not an issue. How do you get an exception approved throughout your organization? What does that workflow look like? And how long do you spend on a ServiceNow ticket waiting weeks for someone to respond? So that whole concept of getting dev, sec, and ops working better together across that workflow, across the software development lifecycle, and having more end-to-end visibility into what everybody is doing and optimizing the throughput, optimizing the flow. Right? Think about that engineer who's designing that pipeline, designing that assembly line for all the folks that got to basically, assemble the component and put out the right software.
Yeah.
Well, how do you make that process incredibly smooth? So I think that is the area that a lot of folks don't really spend enough time on, and they allow for drag and friction in their system. Because I've interviewed a lot of developers, and you can say, well, how long do you spend doing that? Oh, that probably takes 3 weeks. And they say it in a way that doesn't exhibit pain when it should.
Mm.
That takes 3 weeks? Oh my god. What are you doing? You
Yeah.
know?
That's a
Yeah, so
feature,
we
man.
yeah, exactly.
I just want to add something because Burr mentioned it. One of the things that we are improving in the organization is adding platforms, adding
Mm.
a single point that many development teams can start consuming. So we can reduce and abstract and provide more functionality in a very easy way or very easy to consume. In
Awesome.
that platform, because the integration between the different tools will be more, it will be with less friction, we can also start adding more policies. And as Burr says, one of the things that we really want to, and it's what the SBOM is showing, is we are trying to add more visibility on what are we actually doing, how we're going to do it, when we're doing it,
Right.
because as much information as we get, we can react faster. We know where our problems, we are not what our costs are. So I'm with Burr, is better integration between our different tools that will lead us to platforms, integrating policies and different tasks that are part of our automation process. And we can add as many times, like for example, static code analysis, dynamic code analysis, best practices, secret detection. So we have to start using all tools with very well-defined policies to help the developers not to take that decision, because
Right.
again, they are not the expert. They cannot take or they shouldn't be taking that kind of decisions.
Awesome.
So yeah.
All right. Well, we are almost out of time. We got 2 minutes. We'll give each of you a minute. What is the one thing or two things that you want to pass on to all of those guys and gals out there building code and developing and getting overwhelmed? What is the one thing, piece of advice, best practice you want to pass on to them? And Burr, we'll let you go first this time.
Okay. Well, I could talk again for hours about some of these topics based on all the different data that I've captured from meeting with different customers and understanding their issues. But there's one higher level meta problem that I see.
Okay.
And this is so it's hard to even draw a picture, even a verbal picture, but I think it's super important. It's all as humans, as a human who basically makes software, software. I'm a software developer, or maybe there's an operations person, a DevOps person that runs the tooling, the platform engineer that puts the developer experience together, the security expert that is also part of this equation. If you think of that dev, sec, and ops, and all those people involved,
Mhm.
as humans, we all have our own different learning capacity, our own cognitive load capacity, and our own learning pace. And so, therefore, if I say something to my colleague, which is the security professional, and say I have a need, they may or may not hear me in the way I need to be heard. This is
Mm,
true of all relationships, right? Anybody who's been in any kind of relationship knows what I'm talking about here. I had a
right.
spouse, had a boyfriend, had a girlfriend, etc., had a child, had a parent, right? This is a human problem. And it takes a lot of effort and a lot of empathy to get through all those learning curves and all those different learning paces. And I think if we just
Mm.
all have greater patience and empathy for each other and have that communication, always communicating with each other, I think that'll fundamentally change the world we work in and the world we live in.
I love it. All righty, Shell.
Well, I'm going to echo some of many ideas of Burr, but for me the most important one is I'm a consumer of software. I not only produce software, but my life it's guided, or it is like technology is all over. Like I fly, I have my account in a bank. So for me, when I go talk to developers, it's like for our sake, for our future and our present sake, we need to deliver the most secure, the most high quality software that we can, because there is no or else. Like there is not something that can be like we cannot stop thinking about, for example, testing, about security, about
Yeah.
quality. So this is happening. And this is happening not because somebody is telling us or poking us. This is happening because it's part of our lives.
Yeah.
And there are lives in the line. So this is the moment. I know it's a challenge, but it's something that we can do with the right team and with the right tools.
That's awesome. Well, thank you both. That was an awesome conversation. It was a pleasure to have y'all on. And to everyone out there, I hope you got some of these best practices and things to take away. Again, write your questions in the chat. But today, we went through a lot in the world of CI/CD and software supply chain security. Covered a lot of ground, everything from understanding the initial landscape to understanding how old Burr is because of the coding languages he gave us that he worked on. But the biggest thing was understanding the risks, how to look at what could be a fearful situation, these monsters under the bed, and work through with automation, tools, best practices, and processes to reduce the risk, increase the security, and still get your software out on time. Security is not a one size fits all affair. We saw today it's contextual and continuously evolving based on your environment. So whether you're a developer, a security expert, or someone managing a team, staying proactive and informed is crucial. So before we go, I'd like to extend our gratitude to Red Hat again for sponsoring the event. Thank you so much. And a big thanks to all of you for joining us. Your questions will be answered here in just a minute, but this engaging conversation was hopefully something that you can take back and do in your own companies with your own pipelines. If you found our conversation valuable, want to see more just like it, again, go to dzone.com/events. And thanks once again for tuning in. Have a great day and stay secure out there.